Big news! Boost Mobile is now sending experts nationwide to deliver and set up customers' new phones at home or work.
Wait, we're going on tour?
Not a tour. We're delivering and setting up customers' phones so it's easier to upgrade.
Let's get in the tour bus and hit the road.
No, not a tour bus. It's a regular car we use to deliver and set up customers' phones at home or work.
Are you a groupie on this tour?
We deliver and set up phones. It's not a tour.
Oh, you're definitely a groupie.
Introducing Store to Door. Switch and get a new device with expert setup and delivery wherever you're at.
Delivery available for select devices purchased at boostmobile.com. Dreaming of getting the all-new iPhone 17 Pro designed to be the most powerful iPhone ever?
Then stay in bed and let a Boost Mobile expert deliver and set it up for you.
Oh, actually, they will have to get up and open the door.
Oh, right.
Delivery available for select devices purchased at boostmobile.com. Terms apply.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Last week was a bit of a kind of a damp squib as far as podcasting went. I was hoping to do a little bit more, and unfortunately, my son was really poorly throughout the week, and you know how it goes. So here we are, back on it. And today I want to talk a bit more about Hobsbawm. For those who aren't familiar with Eric Hobsbawm's work, Eric Hobsbawm was probably the most significantly important British historian of the 20th century. There are a number of other kind of key luminaries there to take that title, but Hobsbawm is arguably the kind of almost like the key figure in the landscape of British 20th century historical writing. Hobsbawm's a controversial figure. Hobsbawm was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. He was the part of the kind of historians group of the Communist Party of Great Britain, along with E.P. Thompson and Christopher Hill. E.P. Thompson, who wrote about the development of the working class, particularly the formation of the English working class, and Christopher Hill, Marxist historian of the Civil War period. So Hobsbawm and the other two formed in the 1950s, really this kind of triumvirate. But Hill and Thompson left the Communist Party. The Communist Party is a Stalinist party, and they left the Communist Party after the invasion of Hungary in 1956. The view of the Communist Party that had perpetuated since the 1930s, a very selective view of Stalin and the Soviet Union, was that for sure the revolution was a rough business, and Stalinism was the kind of the extension of the development of a revolutionary society, and quite rough and ready. However, you have to break a few eggs to make an omelette, and the Communist Party, by in turn was pro-Soviet, obviously pro-Soviet during the Nazi-Soviet Pact, and opposed Britain's involvement in the war, and then after 1941 wholeheartedly supported Britain's alliance with the Soviet Union. There was a belief amongst many in the 1930s that the only force that could possibly stand up to Hitler was Soviet communism. It wasn't an unfounded thought, really. And also that Soviet communism, when it emerged from this very violent phase, and even people like Roosevelt thought this, would become a kind of like a more mature sort of people's republic. And it's this is why it takes up until 1956 for the scales to fall from the eyes of many British communists. The support for the British Communist Party collapses in 1956, and in the 60s and 70s you get the development of a new left in Britain and elsewhere, which is kind of a story for a different time. But when you think about the kind of idealism, misguided, albeit, that motivated people like the Cambridge spies, like Philby and Burgess and Blunt and Maclean. It was the idea that a new progressive society was actually being built in the Soviet Union. And obviously by 1956 it becomes very, very hard to argue that. The idea that the Soviet Union is progressive at all kind of dies as the tanks rumble in to Budapest. And then once again in Czechoslovakia in 1968. So we were looking at the Age of Extremes last time, and here we will continue. The Age of Extremes is Eric Hobsbawm's short 20th century, 1914 to 1991. Oh, we should say, by the way, Hobsbawm's justification for not leaving the Communist Party, for staying with the Communist Party, even though he was well aware of the crimes of Stalin, was essentially, once you've picked a team, you've picked a team. And he said, despite everything he knew, he still believed that the Communist Party and Soviet communism was the vehicle for kind of the emancipation of humanity. And he garnered a lot of flack for this. He was a hugely criticised figure in liberal circles. However, his actual analysis of 20th century events is still lauded, even on the political right. I mean, when I saw Hobsbawm in one of his final public appearances, would be in the late 2000s, it's something like about 2008, he was introduced by Niall Ferguson, of all people. And Niall Ferguson and Hobsbawm sat on the stage at the Hay Festival, and Ferguson said, look, I agree with many of the things Hobsbawm argues. Ferguson is no Marxist, the absolute antithesis of that. But the analysis, I don't agree with virtually anything Niall Ferguson says, but you look at his books and the depth of research is quite remarkable, and the positions that he's taking, whilst kind of imperialist and reactionary for the most part, have the kind of the same base of research that Hobsbawm's do. How he comes to the conclusions he does is a question for the ages, but there you go. Okay, so Hobsbawm writes, so his book, The Age of Extremes, The Short 20th Century, 1914 to 1991. His argument here is that is kind of a historical parenthesis. It's a kind of a discrete period in its own right. My argument is that there was actually a long 20th century that ends in 2008, and we're just experiencing the first moments of the 21st century, probably around now, but I'm sure you can shoot holes in that one. How are we to make sense of the short 20th century, Hobsbawm writes? That is to say, of the years from the outbreak of the First World War to the collapse of the USSR, which, as we can now see in retrospect, forms a coherent historical period that has now ended. We do not know what will come next and what the third millennium will be like, even though we can be certain that the short 20th century will have shaped it. However, there can be no serious doubt that in the late 1980s and early 1990s, an era in the world history ended and a new one began. That is the essential information for historians of this century. For though they can speculate about the future in the light of their understanding of the past, their business is not that of the racing tipster. The only horse races they can claim to report and analyse are those already won or lost. In any case, the record of forecasters in the past 30 or 40 years, whatever their professional qualifications of profits, has been so spectacularly bad that only governments and economic research units still have, or pretend to have, much confidence in it. It's even possible it has got worse since the Second World War. In this book, the structure of the short 20th century appears like a sort of triptych or historical sandwich. An Age of Catastrophe, or from 1914 to the aftermath of the Second World War, was followed by some 25 or 30 years of extraordinary economic growth and social transformation, which probably changed human society more profoundly than any other period of comparable brevity. In retrospect, it can be seen as a sort of golden age, and was so seen almost immediately it had come to an end in the early 1970s. The last part of this century was a new area of decomposition, uncertainty and crisis, and indeed for large parts of the world such as Africa, the former USSR and the formerly socialist parts of Europe, of catastrophe. As the 1980s gave way to the 1990s, the mood of those who reflected on the century's past and future was a growing fin de siècle gloom. From the vantage point of the 1990s, the short 20th century passed through a brief golden age on the way from one era of crisis to another, into an unknown and problematic but not necessarily apocalyptic future. However, as historians may wish to remind metaphysical speculators about the end of history, there will be a future. The only completely certain generalization about history is that so long as there is a human race, it will go on.
It's Hey girl, what's happening? Is that your antiperspirant?
Yeah.
Let me see that can. Aluminum butane. I cannot pronounce that. You have to switch to Native deodorant. Native Simple Formula has only clean ingredients. It gives you effective 72-hour odor protection with no hydrocarbon propellants.
Wow, this smells heavenly.
Clean, effective 72-hour odor protection isn't a myth.
It's Native.
The argument of this book is organized accordingly. It begins with the First World War, which marked the breakdown of Western civilization from the 19th century. This civilization was capitalist in its economy, liberal in its legal and constitutional structure, bourgeois in its image of its characteristic hegemonic class, glorying in the advance of science, knowledge and education, material and moral progress, and profoundly convinced of the centrality of Europe, birthplace of the revolutions of the science, arts, politics and industry, whose economy had penetrated and whose soldiers had conquered and subjugated most of the world, whose populations had grown until, including the vast and growing outflow of European emigrants and their descendants, they had risen to form a third of the human race, and whose major states constituted the system of world politics. Obviously, Hobsbawm describes all of that in his previous 3 volumes. I've often taken the view that from 1914 to 1945 is a kind of a period of European civil war. It is a period of European civil war, firstly between European empires, and then between a kind of division between the surviving empires of the First World War and new hungry revanchist states, Italy, Germany. Spain may well have joined in that, and there were various other parts of the Habsburg Empire, Hungary, for example, that joined in Operation Barbarossa and was a key Nazi ally. And this is this European civil war is finally brought to an end by nuclear power and the rise of nuclear superpowers. And I draw from Hobsbawm and a little bit from Richard Overy and his book Blood and Ruins, and which tries to kind of explain this period of catastrophe. The kind of epicenter of crisis in Europe during that period, or the kind of the key cause of crisis during that period, is imperialism. You have one imperial war that's ended with a flawed imperial conference at Paris in 1919, and then the Paris Order or the Versailles Order disintegrates up until the late 1930s, where you have a really war beginning, global conflict beginning significantly earlier than September 1939, and it beginning obviously in China, and so this kind of age of catastrophe is the product of a century or more, perhaps a century and a half, of imperial development, imperial growth, colonization, subjugation, conquest. The argument of the kind of like the boomerang argument, the Ames Caesar sort of imperial boomerang argument that kind of gas and barbed wire and machine guns and racial eradication had all first been experienced by Africans and Asians and South Americans at the hands of white Europeans. And this flows back, all these violent, brutal imperial techniques flow back to the continent of Europe in the 20th century for Europeans to inflict on each other. And I think there's a kind of a huge kind of amount of validity to that. This is why you get imperial administrators in Nazi Germany, Soviet imperial administrators, if you will, talking about moving around entire populations, eradicating inconvenient populations, and it being, nothing especially new, and there have being sort of precedent for these sorts of things. It's quite well known that Hitler looked at India under the British and the eradication of the Native Americans from America's Great Plains with this is what we'll need to do to Russia, sweep away the savages and build civilization, because then that's what the British and the Americans have done. This is a good thing. One of Hitler's closest collaborators up to 1923, a guy called Max Schreibner Richter, who was killed at the Munich Beer Hall Putsch, had been a military attaché to the Ottoman Empire and had witnessed the Armenian genocide. I think Schreibner Richter had actually, because these were Muslims murdering good Christians, and he'd actually intervened to protest on behalf of the Kaiser's government, but returned and I believe had passed on what he had witnessed, and it's interesting what kind of, because Hitler later references the Armenian genocide as who remembers the Armenian Christians, in a nobody will care.
Switching between tools for one project gets disjointed, especially on tight deadlines. Grammarly built a game-changing writing surface tailor-made for professionals to help you move your ideas forward and sharpen your writing. You can brainstorm ideas, summarize meeting notes in seconds, or strengthen a proposal without context switching. Easy to get started and even easier to finish. Sign up for Grammarly free and get your professional writing from draft to done. Visit Grammarly.com. That's Grammarly.com.
At Blinds.com, it's not just about window treatments. It's about you, your style, your space, your way. Whether you DIY or want the pros to handle it all, you'll have the confidence of knowing it's done right. From free expert design help to our 100% satisfaction guarantee, everything we do is made to fit your life and your windows. Because at Blinds.com, the only thing we treat better than windows is you. Visit Blinds.com now for up to 45% off select styles, plus a free professional measure. Rules and restrictions apply.
And so it shows you how the violence of empire creates conditions for and precedent for the horrors of the 20th century. I mean, part of this is the First and Second World War has this distorting effect on history, and John Pilger referred to the Second World War as a cleansing moral bath for British, French, and American imperialism. That the baddies had been eradicated, and by extension, other imperialisms are good. But if you imagine, when we're talking about the destruction of Warsaw, the bombing of Rotterdam, the purging of the Krakow ghetto, we're looking at the destruction of the Czech village of Lidice, things like that. And these are all contained within a kind of like a time period, 1939 to 245. Well, when you are somebody in rural El Salvador facing death squads, when you are an Algerian in the 1960s or 1950s and 1960s, when you are somebody in Vietnam under Operation Rolling Thunder, hearing about these kinds of things, do you conclude that for you the Second World War never really ended, or that the kind of the atrocities experienced by Belgians and Norwegians and French and Dutch and Germans under Allied bombing as well, that this is just kind of business as usual? The Second World War and this Age of Catastrophe really kind of diverts attention away from the fact that for large parts of the world, modernity has been an age of catastrophe. The fate of the Palestinians was decided before the Second World War, and it continued after the Second World War. There were different phases of this, and we are perhaps in the worst phase right now. But I think sometimes the Second World War, understandably and naturally, has this distorting effect. And the Second World, the key thing about the Second World War, it is the last war between the great powers. And we know in the post-war era that great powers can't afford to go to war with one another again. There's lots of speculation. If you look on YouTube and look on the kind of like the Times YouTube channel, there's normally somebody, retired major general, somebody saying, well, Trump is going to take us into World War III. I'm not so sure. I think people like Trump like easy wins. They like to attack Iran. I mean, of course, World War III can happen by pure stupidity and accident. I don't think Trump has any appetite to take on China or Russia or anyone with remotely the capacity to fight back. And China and Russia don't want a war with the United States of America. Great power wars. I mean, it's foolish to speculate, really, isn't it? But I think the thing that we learn after the end of the Second World War, and the thing that kind of makes the Second World War unique, given that we're in this kind of age of genocides, age of catastrophes, age of horrors, and this golden age that Hobsbawm talks about, it's not a golden age if you're in Indonesia. It's not a golden age if you're in Vietnam. It's not a golden age if you're living in up to the kind of the mid 1950s in Korea. The level of destruction in Korea is seriously underexplored. It's not a golden age for the people experiencing the partition of India and a lot of the communal violence that follows from there on in. It's a golden age for Europeans for the most part. So the thing that kind of is the only thing I think that's exceptional about the Second World War period is that it is fought between at the imperial core, and that's not where traditionally for the previous kind of 100 or so years wars are meant to be fought. Of course, there are things like the Franco-Prussian War and the Italian Wars of Unification. These are minor spats in comparison to the scale of the First World War. But for the most part, wars are meant to be fought against colonized peoples. And this is the war of the colonizers against the colonizers. So, anyway, Hobsbawm continues. The decades from the outbreak of the First World War to the aftermath of the Second was an age of catastrophe for this society. For 40 years, it stumbled from one calamity to another. There were times when even intelligent conservatives would not take bets on its survival. It was shaken by 2 world wars, followed by 2 waves of global rebellion and revolution, which brought to power a system that claimed to be a historically predestined alternative to bourgeois and capitalist society. First over 1/6 of the world's land surface, and then after the Second World War, over 1/3 of the global population. The huge colonial empires built up before and during the Age of Empire were shaken and crumbled to dust. The entire history of modern imperialism, so firm and self-confident when Queen Victoria of Great Britain died, had lasted no longer than a single lifetime, say that of Winston Churchill, 1874 to 1965. More than this, a world economic crisis of unprecedented depth brought even the strongest capitalist economies to their knees and seemed to reverse the creation of a single universal world economy, which had been so remarkable an achievement in the 19th century to liberal capitalism. Even the USA, safe from war and revolution, seemed close to collapse. While the economy tottered, the institutions of liberal democracy virtually disappeared between 1917 and 1942 from all but a fringe of Europe and parts of North America and Australasia as fascism and its satellite authoritarian movements and regimes advanced. Okay, so there's like a load to unpack there, and then again, Hobsbawm is right, and yet there's just something about his focus, I think, that is very, very Eurocentric, and I think ignores the wider dynamics of the 20th century. But I'm going to leave you there. And I want to return to Hobsbawm later this week. And perhaps we'll keep dipping into him throughout the year. But have a good one, everybody. Take good care. And remember, if you want to get these episodes without adverts, check us out on Patreon. Take care. All the best. Bye-bye.
When the flu is keeping you up at night, don't try to tough it out. Knock out your flu symptoms with NyQuil Intense Flu. You got this. It provides powerful relief of your flu symptoms so you can sleep well through the night. NyQuil Intense Flu. The nighttime sniffling, aching, fever, best sleep with a flu medicine. Use as directed. Keep out of reach of children.
Did you know that parents rank financial literacy as the #1 most difficult life skill to teach? Meet Greenlight, the debit card and money app for families. With Greenlight, you can set up chores, automate allowance, and keep an eye on your kids' spending with real-time notifications. Kids learn to earn, save, and spend wisely, and parents can rest easy knowing their kids are learning about money with guardrails in place. Sign up for Greenlight today at greenlight.com/podcast.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.